A man loses both parents by age 11, flees his homeland with nothing, and ends up wandering the streets of Munich eating from soup kitchens. Fast forward 2 decades and this same broken individual becomes one of history's most dangerous ideologues, helping shape the twisted worldview that would lead to the deaths of millions. Yet today barely anyone remembers his name. While everyone knows Hitler, Himmler, and Goebbels, the man who literally wrote the book on Nazi racial theory remains hidden in the shadows of history. But here's the thing that should terrify us all. His ideas didn't die with him. They're still out there, still influencing people, still spreading hate. So buckle up, because today we're diving deep into the life of Alfred Rosenberg, the man who gave Nazism its intellectual foundation, and trust me, his story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about how evil ideologies take root. Let's start at the very beginning, because Alfred's origin story reads like a tragedy that was destined to create a monster. Born on a freezing January day in 1893 in what's now Tallinn, Estonia, Alfred Rosenberg entered a world that was already torn apart by ethnic conflict. Back then, the city was called Reval, and it sat right in the middle of a centuries-old battleground where Germans, Russians, and Estonians had been fighting for control. His father, Voldemar, was a successful businessman managing German company affairs in Estonia. Here's the irony that'll blow your mind. The man who would become Nazi Germany's chief racial theorist wasn't even really German himself. His ancestry was primarily Baltic, not Germanic. It's like the ultimate case of imposter syndrome turned deadly. But tragedy struck early and hard. Alfred's mother, Elfrida, died of tuberculosis just 2 months after giving birth to him. Imagine being a newborn and losing the one person who's supposed to protect and nurture you. Then when Alfred was just 11 years old, his father died too, leaving him completely orphaned. He was raised by his aunts, but the damage was already done. This kid had been abandoned by life itself, and something dark was growing inside him. The family was Lutheran Protestant, and young Alfred absolutely despised it. He later wrote about how kneeling during church services made him feel physically sick, saying it stirred up something inside him that could never be calmed. Think about that for a second. A child who's lost everything, forced to kneel before a God who seems to have abandoned him completely. Is it any wonder he'd grow up rejecting traditional religion and searching for something else to believe in? As Alfred grew up, he found himself caught in the middle of an ethnic powder keg. Estonia was part of something called the Pale of Settlement, where the Russian Empire forced Jewish people to live. The region was a melting pot of Germans, Russians, Estonians, and Jewish communities, all trying to coexist while tensions simmered beneath the surface. Alfred was a decent student and even showed some artistic talent as a painter. Sound familiar? Just like Hitler, he had creative aspirations. But unlike the future dictator, Alfred never seriously considered making art his career. Instead, he headed off to study at the Polytechnical Institute in Riga. And here's where things get really dark. This is where his hatred of Jewish people first took root. Now here's what's absolutely chilling about this. There was no dramatic event, no personal betrayal, no specific incident that turned Alfred against Jewish people. He just absorbed the rising tide of anti-Semitism that was sweeping across Europe at the time. It was like a poison in the air, and Alfred breathed it in deeply. By the time he was a young man, he was already convinced that Jewish people were somehow responsible for all of society's problems. When World War I erupted in 1914, Alfred found himself in a unique position. He was studying in Riga when the city became a frontline battleground between German and Russian forces. The school had to evacuate to Moscow, so Alfred spent most of the war in the Russian capital, renting a small room and completing his architecture degree. And get this, for his final project, he designed a crematorium. Knowing what we know about his future role in the Holocaust, That choice seems almost prophetically sinister. During the war, Alfred met and married Hilda Liesmann, daughter of a wealthy businessman. But their happiness was short-lived. Hilda nearly died from tuberculosis in 1917, the same disease that had killed Alfred's mother. While she was recovering by the Black Sea, the Russian Revolution exploded across the country. When Alfred and Hilda returned north, they found themselves in the middle of a completely transformed world. The Bolsheviks had taken power and were ceding massive amounts of territory to Germany, including Alfred's homeland of Estonia. But German control didn't last long. When Germany lost the war, Estonia declared independence, and suddenly Alfred found himself a man without a country. Like tens of thousands of other ethnic Germans, he packed up his life and headed west to what remained of the German Empire. Alfred's first stop was Berlin, where he hoped to find work as an architect, but violence seemed to follow him everywhere. No sooner had he arrived than the city exploded into the Spartacist uprising, a communist revolution that sent Alfred fleeing south to Munich. His wife Hilda became ill again and went to Switzerland for treatment. Their marriage was falling apart, and by 1923 they were divorced. So picture this scene. Alfred Rosenberg, 26 years old, wandering the streets of Munich completely alone and penniless. He's lost his parents, his homeland, his wife, and his prospects. He's eating at soup kitchens and looking for any odd job he can find. Germany itself is tearing apart at the seams, ravaged by defeat, poverty, and political chaos. It's in this moment of absolute desperation that Alfred encounters the man who will change his life forever. One evening, probably feeling like he had nothing left to lose, Alfred attended a gathering led by Dietrich Eckart, a poet and journalist who was one of the founders of something called the German Workers' Party. This was the group that would eventually become the Nazi Party. Eckart took one look at this bitter, broken young man and saw potential. They began meeting regularly, bonding over their shared hatred of Jewish people and their belief that somehow Jewish conspirators were responsible for Germany's downfall. This is where Alfred's transformation from victim to perpetrator really began. He'd already been anti-Semitic, but now he found a community that not only validated his hatred but gave it purpose and direction. When a communist revolt broke out in Munich, Alfred became absolutely convinced that there was indeed a massive Jewish conspiracy to destroy European civilization. The pieces were all falling into place in his twisted mind. Through Eckart, Alfred became involved with something called the Aufbauvereinigung, or Economic Reconstruction Organization. On the surface, this sounded innocent enough, a group trying to rebuild economic ties between Germany and Eastern European countries. But in reality, it was a hotbed of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and ultra-nationalist ideology. They claimed to be promoting economic cooperation, but they were actually working to undermine the new Bolshevik government in Russia and spread their toxic ideas across the region. Alfred threw himself into this work with the passion of a true believer. Remember, this guy had lost everything to the chaos and violence that swept across Eastern Europe after World War I. In his mind, someone had to be blamed for all that suffering, and the Jewish people became his scapegoat. He wasn't just joining a political movement, he was finding a new religion, one that promised to explain all the pain and chaos of his life. By the early 1920s, Alfred had become deeply embedded in Munich's radical right-wing political scene. He joined both the Nazi Party and something called the Thule Society, a group that promoted the fantasy that Germany should return to some imaginary medieval golden age, when German knights supposedly conquered Eastern Europe. These weren't just political clubs. They were breeding grounds for the most extreme and dangerous ideas imaginable. Alfred quickly established himself as the movement's intellectual voice. He became editor of the Völkischer Beobachter, the official Nazi newspaper, and started pumping out a steady stream of articles and pamphlets filled with racial hatred and conspiracy theories. By 1923, he was one of the most senior figures in the Nazi movement, which brings us to one of the most important nights in modern history. November 8, 1923. Alfred stood alongside Hitler, Hermann Göring, and other Nazi leaders as they attempted to seize control of the Bavarian government in what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch. Their plan was simple: capture key government figures, take control of Munich, then march on Berlin and seize power across all of Germany. They were inspired by Mussolini's successful takeover of Italy the year before. But the putsch was an absolute disaster. When the Nazis marched through Munich's Odeonsplatz the next morning, government troops opened fire. 16 people died, dozens more were wounded, and the Nazi leadership was scattered to the winds. Hitler was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison. The Nazi Party was banned. For most political movements, this would have been the end of the story. But Hitler had other plans. From his prison cell, he secretly instructed Alfred to keep the movement alive. Alfred established something called the Greater German People's Community as a front organization to continue Nazi activities while their leader was behind bars. For nearly a year, Alfred Rosenberg was effectively the leader of the Nazi movement. Think about that. During one of the most crucial periods in the party's early development, this broken, bitter man from Estonia was calling the shots. When Hitler was released in 1925, he decided to change tactics completely. No more violent coups. Instead, they would play the democratic game and try to build popular support through elections and propaganda. This is where Alfred really found his calling. While Hitler was the charismatic leader and Goebbels was the master propagandist, Alfred became the movement's chief intellectual, the man who gave Nazism its pseudo-scientific foundation. Throughout the 1920s, Alfred published book after book promoting his twisted racial theories. Titles like Immorality in the Talmud and The Protocols of the Elders of Zion and Jewish World Politics give you a pretty clear idea of where his mind was at. He wasn't just spreading hate. He was trying to dress it up in academic language to make it seem respectable and scholarly. Alfred also became heavily involved with something called the Nordic Society, founded in 1921. This organization spent decades promoting the idea that Germanic and Nordic peoples were the master race of Europe. They held cultural events, published books, and worked tirelessly to create connections between Germany and Scandinavian countries. In 1928, Alfred helped organize an Icelandic art exhibition that tried to link modern Germany with the Viking conquests of the medieval period. They were essentially promoting German cultural imperialism, preparing the ground for the physical conquest that would come later. But Alfred's masterpiece of hatred came in 1930 with the publication of The Myth of the 20th Century. This massive book was Alfred's attempt to create a complete racial worldview for the Nazi movement. According to his theory, there was once a perfect Aryan race that had migrated from the Asian steppes to conquer large parts of Europe and Asia. The Germanic and Nordic peoples were supposedly the purest descendants of these Aryans, while other groups had been corrupted through intermarriage with Semitic peoples. The book was absolutely insane. Alfred claimed that ancient Egyptians were actually Aryans because he liked the idea that his supposed master race had built the pyramids. He argued that Jesus was half Germanic, which made absolutely no historical sense. He even interpreted the French wars of religion as part of some grand effort to eliminate Aryan influence from French society. None of this was based on actual evidence or scholarship. It was pure fantasy designed to justify hatred and violence. But here's the terrifying part. The book became a bestseller. Alfred had tapped into something dark in the German psyche during a period of economic crisis and political chaos. His pseudo-intellectual approach gave people permission to embrace their worst impulses while feeling smart and sophisticated about it. He wasn't just spreading hate, he was making it fashionable. The timing couldn't have been more perfect for the Nazi movement. The Wall Street crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed destroyed Germany's brief period of prosperity and stability. Suddenly, millions of Germans were unemployed, desperate, and looking for someone to blame. Alfred's books provided the intellectual framework for that blame, pointing the finger squarely at Jewish people and other minority groups. In a series of elections in 1930 and 1932, the Nazis went from being a regional curiosity to becoming the largest political party in Germany. They formed a coalition government with more traditional conservative parties, then immediately betrayed their partners and seized complete control. By 1933, Hitler was the undisputed leader of Germany, and Alfred Rosenberg found himself in a position to implement his twisted theories on a national scale. Alfred's first major appointment was as head of the Nazi Office of Foreign Affairs. This wasn't the traditional foreign ministry. Instead, it was responsible for building relationships with countries that the Nazis considered culturally similar to Germany. Alfred worked out of the luxurious Hotel Adlon in central Berlin, entertaining foreign dignitaries and traveling to other European capitals to spread Nazi ideology. The results were mixed at best. While Alfred did manage to build connections with some far-right groups like Norway's National Samling, many foreign diplomats found his constant lectures about race and blood to be bizarre and off-putting. His approach was too academic, too theoretical for practical diplomacy. But that didn't matter to Alfred. He was more interested in spreading his ideas than actually achieving diplomatic success. Much more successful was Alfred's role in what the Nazis called the Kirchenkampf, the war against the churches. Germany in the 1930s was an overwhelmingly Christian nation, but the Nazis viewed Christianity as competition for the loyalty of the German people. Many historians now describe Nazism itself as essentially a political religion, with Hitler as its messianic figure and racial purity as its core doctrine. Alfred threw himself into this religious war with the passion of a true believer. He targeted both the Roman Catholic Church and the various Protestant denominations, working to gradually undermine their influence over German society. In 1938, he gave a speech declaring that both the Catholic Church and the Confessional Church must disappear from the life of our people. This was the same man who had hated kneeling in church as a child, now trying to destroy Christianity itself. The conflict escalated throughout the decade. In 1934, the Vatican tried to place Alfred's Myth of the 20th Century on their list of prohibited books. 3 years later, Pope Pius XI issued an encyclical called Mit brennender Sorge, with deep anxiety, that directly condemned Nazi attacks on the church and criticized the kind of neo-paganism that Alfred was promoting. The document was smuggled into Germany and distributed to Catholic churches across the country. In it, Hitler was referred to as a mad prophet, showing just how hostile the relationship had become. But Alfred wasn't just trying to destroy Christianity. He was actively promoting an alternative. Working closely with SS leader Heinrich Himmler, Alfred developed a bizarre neo-pagan belief system that mixed German folk traditions with Nazi ideology. He incorporated elements from a medieval French heretical sect called the Cathars, combined them with worship of Norse gods like Thor and Odin, and created what can only be described as a completely incoherent religious philosophy. The scary thing is, it worked. Millions of Germans began embracing these ideas, abandoning their traditional faiths for this new religion of race and nationalism. Alfred had successfully weaponized spirituality itself, turning people's natural desire for meaning and community into fuel for hatred and violence. In 1934, Alfred was given even more power when Hitler established something called Amt Rosenberg, the Rosenberg Office. This was essentially a government department with oversight of all cultural policy in Germany. From his offices near Berlin's Potsdamer Platz, Alfred could interfere in virtually every aspect of German cultural life. His office decided which books could be published, which art could be displayed, which ideas could be taught in schools. Under Alfred's direction, the works of great German writers like Thomas Mann, Bertolt Brecht, and Erich Maria Remarque were banned and removed from libraries across the country. These weren't foreign authors. They were German citizens whose only crime was refusing to bow down to Nazi ideology. Meanwhile, Alfred promoted writers who championed German nationalism and racial superiority. The E.A. Rosenberg Office also established something called the National Socialist Cultural Community, which grew to include hundreds of chapters and tens of thousands of members across Germany. It was essentially a militant book club designed to spread Nazi ideology through cultural activities. They organized reading groups, art exhibitions, and educational programs, all designed to indoctrinate ordinary Germans with Alfred's racial theories. Alfred's influence extended into sports and recreation through his involvement with the Strength Through Joy movement, which provided recreational activities for German workers. Even leisure time wasn't safe from his ideological meddling. Every aspect of German cultural life was being systematically poisoned with his ideas about racial superiority and ethnic hatred. In 1937, Alfred received what was probably the highest honor of his career. Hitler created a new award called the German National Prize for Art and Science as an alternative to the Nobel Prize, which the Nazis had rejected after it was awarded to a German pacifist journalist who had exposed their illegal rearmament program. Alfred was one of the first 5 recipients honored specifically for his work promoting Nazi racial theories. The prize came with 100,000 Reichsmarks, making him a very wealthy man. At the award ceremony, Joseph Goebbels, who was actually one of Alfred's biggest rivals within the Nazi hierarchy, was forced to read a citation praising Alfred's work. The irony wasn't lost on Alfred, who took great pleasure in seeing his rival forced to publicly acknowledge his contributions to the movement. The citation stated that only future generations will be able to assess accurately just how deeply this man influenced the spiritual shape and worldview of the National Socialist state. Those words would prove to be more prophetic than anyone could have imagined. Because as Germany prepared for war in the late 1930s, Alfred's role was about to expand dramatically. His theories about racial superiority and the need for German living space in Eastern Europe had helped provide the intellectual justification for what was coming next, a war of conquest and extermination unlike anything the world had ever seen. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, triggering World War II, Alfred initially continued his cultural and propaganda work. But everything changed in June 1941 when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union. Suddenly, Alfred found himself returning to his homeland for the first time in over 20 years, not as a refugee but as a conqueror. Hitler appointed Alfred as Reich Minister for the occupied Eastern territories, putting him in charge of governing much of Eastern Europe. The man who had fled Estonia as a penniless refugee was now returning as one of the most powerful officials in Nazi Germany. The irony was staggering. Alfred was coming home to implement the very racial theories that his difficult childhood had helped create. Alfred's vision for Eastern Europe was both grandiose and terrifying. He proposed dividing the entire region into 4 massive administrative zones called Reichskommissariats. One of these, called Ostland or Eastland, would include his native Estonia along with Latvia, Lithuania, and parts of Belarus. The name itself was significant. Ostland had been a medieval term for the Baltic region when German crusading knights had conquered and colonized it centuries earlier. Alfred was literally trying to recreate the medieval German Empire in Eastern Europe. His plans called for turning the Slavic populations into a permanent underclass, working as serfs for German colonists who would settle on their lands. While some other Nazi leaders proposed the mass murder of tens of millions of Eastern Europeans to make room for German settlers, Alfred's approach was slightly less genocidal. He only wanted to enslave them. How generous. But implementing these theories proved much more difficult than writing about them. Alfred immediately found himself in conflict with other Nazi leaders who had their own plans for Eastern Europe. Hermann Göring controlled economic policy, Heinrich Himmler ran security operations, and Hans Frank governed occupied Poland. Hitler deliberately created these overlapping jurisdictions to keep his subordinates fighting each other instead of challenging his authority. Alfred became obsessed with dismantling the Soviet collective farm system and redistributing land to private owners. While this might sound reasonable, it was actually a massive distraction during wartime. His rivals exploited these administrative problems to undermine his influence with Hitler. Meanwhile, the war itself was turning against Germany. But Alfred's most horrific contribution to Nazi rule was his direct involvement in the Holocaust. As early as winter 1941, he was boasting that Estonia had been declared empty of Jewish people after SS death squads had murdered virtually the entire Jewish population. In November 1941, just as plans for the systematic extermination of European Jewry were being finalized, Alfred gave one of the most chilling speeches in human history. Speaking to a gathering of Nazi officials, Alfred declared, "Some 6 million Jews still live in the East, and this question can only be solved by a biological extermination of the whole of Jewry in Europe. The Jewish question will only be solved for Germany when the last Jew has left German territory, and it will only be solved for Europe when not a single Jew stands on the European continent as far as the Urals." Let that sink in for a moment. This man, who had started life as an orphaned refugee, was now calmly discussing the systematic murder of an entire people. The broken child had become one of history's greatest monsters. While Alfred wasn't personally present at the infamous Wannsee Conference in January 1942, where the final solution was organized, his top deputies were there and reported everything back to him. He had particular jurisdiction over the Holocaust in Latvia, where an estimated 70,000 of the 93,000 Jewish residents were murdered. In summer 1942, Alfred personally visited a Jewish ghetto in Ukraine that was liquidated just weeks later, sending thousands to their deaths. Throughout this period, Alfred was also overseeing one of history's largest cultural theft operations. His Reichsleiter Rosenberg task force systematically looted museums, galleries, libraries, and private collections across occupied Europe. Nearly 500,000 tons of cultural artifacts were stolen and shipped to Neuschwanstein Castle in Bavaria. Paintings, manuscripts, sculptures, books, anything of cultural value was fair game. Many of these treasures are still missing today, nearly 80 years later. But Alfred's moment in the sun was brief. By 1942, the tide of war was turning against Germany. The failure to defeat the Soviet Union in 1941, followed by America's entry into the war, meant that Germany was now fighting a multi-front conflict it couldn't win. As military defeats mounted, Hitler began lashing out at anyone he could blame for the disasters. Alfred, like many other Nazi leaders, found himself increasingly cut off from the Führer's inner circle. The final years of the war were a slow-motion catastrophe for Alfred personally and for Nazi Germany as a whole. The Battle of Stalingrad ended in crushing defeat for German forces in early 1943, and from that point on, Soviet armies were steadily pushing westward. By autumn 1944, Alfred's beloved Baltic homeland had been liberated. Tallinn fell to Soviet forces in September, followed by Riga in October. Alfred, watching from Berlin as his empire crumbled, wrote in his diary, "In the East, incessant retreat." The man who had dreamed of German dominion over Eastern Europe was watching his fantasies collapse in real time. He met with Hitler for the final time in February 1945, shocked by the dictator's physical and mental deterioration. Even Alfred could see that the end was near. As Soviet forces approached Berlin in April 1945, Alfred made preparations for the end. He stockpiled cyanide pills, determined not to be taken alive by the Russians, who had every reason to want revenge for what he had done to their people. Along with his second wife, Hedwig, and their daughter, Irene, Alfred fled Berlin for the German-Danish border, arriving in the town of Flensburg just days before Hitler's suicide. On May 19, 1945, Alfred Rosenberg was taken into British custody. As his plane flew over the bombed-out ruins of Cologne, he looked down at the devastation and wrote that the city looked like it had been trampled down by gigantic beasts. The rubble was heaped around the skeleton of the cathedral like a desert, giving evidence of the terrible fate of people and Reich. The man who had helped bring this destruction to the world was finally beginning to understand the consequences of his actions. Alfred was selected as one of the main defendants for the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, the trial that would determine the fate of Nazi Germany's leadership. Alongside him in the dock were Göring, Himmler's deputies, the foreign ministers who had helped plan the war, and the generals who had carried out mass murder on the Eastern Front. For nearly a year, the world watched as the crimes of the Nazi regime were laid bare in excruciating detail. Throughout the trial, Alfred maintained his innocence, claiming he had been unaware of the mass murder of Jewish people. This was completely implausible given his roles in the government, and the fact that his own subordinates had been present at the Wannsee Conference where the final solution was planned. But Alfred stuck to his story, perhaps hoping that his reputation as an intellectual rather than a hands-on administrator might save his life. It didn't work. On October 1, 1946, the verdicts were announced. Alfred Rosenberg was one of only 6 defendants found guilty on all 4 charges: crimes against peace, planning aggressive war, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to death by hanging. In the early hours of October 16, 1946, Alfred Rosenberg was led to the gallows. When asked if he had any final words, he simply said no. Of all the Nazi leaders executed that night, he was the only one who remained silent to the end. His body was cremated, and the ashes scattered in southern Germany to prevent his grave from becoming a shrine for future Nazi sympathizers. So why should we care about Alfred Rosenberg today? Why does this forgotten Nazi matter when we already know about Hitler, Himmler, and Goebbels? Because Alfred represents something uniquely dangerous, the intellectual who provides scholarly respectability to hatred and violence. He took the raw anti-Semitism and nationalism of his era and dressed it up in academic language, making it seem rational and scientific. Alfred shows us how broken, traumatized individuals can become instruments of mass destruction when they find ideologies that give meaning to their pain by channeling it into hatred of others. His life demonstrates how personal suffering, instead of creating empathy and compassion, can sometimes produce its exact opposite, a desire to inflict that same suffering on others. But perhaps most importantly, Alfred Rosenberg reminds us that ideas have consequences. The books he wrote, the theories he promoted, the cultural movements he led, these weren't just academic exercises. They were the intellectual foundation for genocide. His words became the justification for the murder of millions of innocent people. The prosecutors at Nuremberg understood this. They repeatedly emphasized that through works like The Myth of the 20th Century, Alfred had been one of the ideological architects of the Third Reich. He hadn't just followed orders. He had helped create the worldview that made those orders seem necessary and justified. Today, as we see new forms of extremism spreading through social media and online communities, Alfred Rosenberg's story serves as a warning. Dangerous ideas don't always come from obvious villains. Sometimes they come from people who present themselves as intellectuals and scholars. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one with a PhD and a bookshelf full of academic credentials. Alfred Rosenberg died believing he was a misunderstood genius whose racial theories would eventually be vindicated by history. Instead, he's remembered as one of the principal architects of humanity's darkest chapter. His life reminds us that intelligence without wisdom, scholarship without conscience, and ideas without humanity can become the most dangerous forces on Earth. The next time you encounter someone promoting theories about racial superiority, genetic destiny, or the supposed inferiority of other groups, remember Alfred Rosenberg. Remember how a broken, bitter man from Estonia helped convince an entire nation to embrace genocide. Remember that ideas matter. Words have power, and the person writing the academic paper might be more dangerous than the person holding the gun. What do you think? Was Alfred Rosenberg truly one of the most influential Nazi leaders, or has history overlooked him for good reason? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if this deep dive into one of history's most dangerous minds opened your eyes to something new, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more forgotten stories that shaped our world. Because the only way to prevent history from repeating itself is to understand how it happened in the first place.